we noticed that at different times in history, we do have certain readings in the Quran that they were excluded from, what we call now the canon. So we call basically the first stage what everyone is familiar with, the Uthmanic Codex. And this is the first canonization process where the readings or the codices of the companions of Muhammad, they were excluded based on the Codex of Uthman. So even though Uthman's attempt to limit the variants of the Quran to one codex, variant readings kept multiplying. And this is evident from the early works of grammar and exegesis that we have, that you have uncontrollable amount of variants that Muslims were using and circulating among themselves. So the second canonization is what Ibn Mujahid did out of a corpus of, I don't want to say unlimited, but many readings that existed back then, probably as many as 50, as sources tell us. He chose 7 readings. And also in Ibn Mujahid's system, when he chose the 7 readings, each reading was not unique. So you can see also there are differences within one reading. So we find many readings in Ibn Mujahid that people stopped reciting today, and even stopped reciting 300 years, after him. He also disagrees, I think 7 or 8 times with the canonical readings themselves. He also has a lot of, I think I counted 64 transmission errors in his book, where he said that this transmission is wrong, this is wrong, it should be this way, it should be that way. Around 150 years later on, in North Africa and Muslim Spain back then, so we have Abu Amr al-Dani and al-Shatibi, both of them, they were scholars of Qira'at, and they were mainly responsible for limiting those different variations or different students and limiting them into 2 only. So people dislike the fact that you are limiting them to a canon. Why are you limiting us to 2 per 1, i.e. 14 transmissions? And we have more readings, we have more variations. 300-400 years later, Ibn al-Jazari in the 9th century Hijri, Islamic calendar, so that would be around the 1400s, he came and added 3 more readings to those 7 by Ibn Mujahid. So that's the 4th period where really the system of 10 readings, or 10 canonical readings, what we call them. And then what I call the 5th canonization, it's the 1923-1924 Cairo edition of the Quran, based on Hafs and Asim. Most Muslims became familiar with that variety, mainly due to the publication, of that codex or that, Mus'haf in Cairo. Even though we have, of course, other editions from other readers, but most people are familiar still, even until today, familiar with that variety. How do we understand this concept of tawatur vis-a-vis qira'at or variant readings when many accounts from the classical sources do not agree with this concept of tawatur? In the early period, Muslims did not talk about this concept of tawatur, and it's very evident that the variant readings were local. So people in Damascus were transmitting things different, from people of Kufa or people from Mecca and Medina, and the reading or the variant reading was a local thing rather than a widely transmitted system that every single Muslim or even every single scholar knew of. If you don't have variant reading, you can't read the Quran. It's as simple as this. It's just you need the vowels and you need diacritics in order to read it. There's you can't read the Quran using your own opinion, and that's in the Islamic tradition you have to rely on how your master taught it and how his master taught it. So you can't just do textual criticism. You can, of course, but you may not within the tradition. So there's a difference between someone who is, who has a manuscript and say, okay, I'm going to do textual criticism. I'm going to read the Quran on my own. And some scholars did that, back in the days. But of course, they were reprimanded. So this is a little bit problematic from the sense of documentation. We don't have enough documentation from the early period, and we don't know how much writing and orality were intertwined back then. And I'm talking here 8th century, okay? There was a time when the Quran was codified during the time of Uthman, when orality lost to written transmission. And what I mean by that is that Muslim scholars all agreed that regardless of your memory, regardless of how you memorize the Quran, you cannot deviate from the Uthmanic Codex. So even though certain readers, they were sure of how they memorized the Quran through other channels, and they were saying that I have a good chain of transmission. I studied with X and Y and Z people. Muslim scholars post-Uthmanic period, they didn't care. As long as you are deviating from the text, we are not going to accept your reading. So when someone tells you, well, the Quran was orally transmitted regardless of the rasm, regardless of the Uthmanic consonantal text, that's not accurate. There's no such thing as only oral transmission. You have to oral transmission based on the text. So there are even transmissions on behalf of the canonical readers, which were also classified as shawaz, as irregular, not accepted. There are also readings attributed to the Prophet himself. We have a category in Qira'at, it's called the readings of the Prophet, okay? And there are, 3 or 4 books even written on that in Arabic. Even though we do have accounts that go back to the Prophet saying that he read this word as such, this word was also categorized as irregular or shawaz. Just like they didn't care. As long as the readings deviate from the Uthmanic Codex, we will consider them to be irregular or shawaz. Even though we know that the Prophet might have read as such, and we also know that the other companions might have read as such. However, the Codex of Uthman abrogated all other codices, abrogated all other readings, and we are going to stick with that. We also have, information from Iraq, from Kufa, that people kept reading according to the codices, let's say, of Ibn Mas'ud, even 150 years after Uthman. So it's uncontrollable in a sense. People were still reading according to the Codex of Ibn Mas'ud, which is different from the Codex of Uthman. In Ibn Mas'ud is very interesting because we as also many people pointed out, we have so many accounts about his rejection and his opposition, right, to the committee that Uthman formed. And he was saying, I'm one of those senior companions of the Prophet. He was criticizing Zayd bin Thabit, the head of the committee. You were a little kid playing with the other kids, and your forelock was dangling, from your head, while I was taking the Quran fresh from the mouth of the Prophet. We always have to remember system readings or eponymous readings are very, very attached to geography, even until today. If you talk to people, in Morocco, they are very proud of their Welsh reading. You have people in Africa, they're very conservative about Abu Amr ibn al-Ala. People are attached locally to their reading. And this was the case also back then. People in Kufa, they were, groupies in a sense. It was the group of Ibn Mas'ud. And they did not want to abandon the reading of Ibn Mas'ud for political reasons. There's a lot of politics happening back then. And we do have, actually, there is an interesting account which you don't find in other accounts. There's some kind of tension between Zayd bin Thabit and Ibn Mas'ud. And actually, Ibn al-Arabi, not Ibn Khaldun, the jurist. He said that people claimed that Uthman and sent someone to beat Ibn Mas'ud. It even reached the stage of beating him and breaking some of his rib bones because of his opposition to the Codex of Uthman. Unfortunately, we don't have manuscripts from that period, but it is very interesting. This paradox is that the Quran is transmitted via tawatur. We have different ways of reading it. How did these eponymous readings or system readings, how were they transmitted? Were they also transmitted via tawatur? And the answer is also problematic, because it seems that in the early period, they were not thinking this concept of tawatur was not applicable to qira'at, okay? It was basically a local thing, this is the reading of the community, let's say, of Kufa or the community of Medina. Later on, what we call the usulis, the scholars of usul al-fiqh, principles of jurisprudence, they came up with this principle of tawatur. However, other scholars also, they oppose this notion because the criteria of tawatur doesn't apply to these. And this is why, but let's say 5th century, 6th century, that would be 11th century, 12th century, there were scholars who were calling for this criteria of tawatur, because you do want the Quran to be mutawatir. If the Quran is not mutawatir, that's a big problem. It is the main source, it is the principal book of Islam. And if the variant readings, the way you access this text, are not mutawatira, then you do have a theological problem. And that's the paradox here. And this is why scholars were back and forth. Even by the time of Ibn al-Jazari, he died 833, so that would be 15th century. In his early life, he was fighting for this concept of tawatur. He said, well, all the qira'at are mutawatira. But then, later on, he did change his mind. Especially in the past, I would say 200 years, there isn't a single book of introduction to Quranic sciences except that they say, well, the variant readings are transmitted via tawatur. They picked up that word. However, where's the footnote? We go to the sources and we see that that's not the case. Can you really prove, the tawatur of qira'at at every single stage back to the Prophet? Was this the case 500 years ago or 600 years ago? And when we see things change over time, we start asking questions. Well, the way we have the qira'at now are different from the way people were reciting. And unfortunately, we don't have, much documentation from that period to give, an answer or an opinion based on facts. But based on these few accounts of why Uthman did this, and actually at every single stage of what I'm calling canonization, the reason why you want to standardize is because you have differences. You don't just come and then you want to standardize something if it's already standardized. You can't afford to have different versions of the Quran available among the Muslim community. Okay, so the whole, they were, I don't want to say obsessed, but this was always something that Muslims were thinking about, that we need to have a standard version. We can't afford having variations. Is to try to get rid of variations and gather all Muslims, on one codex. There are many problematic issues about, the collection, especially the committee that he put. So besides Zayd bin Thabit, or the other 3 members in the committee, the 3 of them, they were 9 to 10 years old when the Prophet died. So they were not really senior companions of him. And 3 of them, they were husbands for 3 of Uthman's daughters. So again, you see how politics here is, very intertwined with, with the decision of who Uthman chose in the committee to standardize the text. So again, politics is very important. People shouldn't dismiss politics and the decision of the state to standardize a text. This happened with Uthman. This happened with Ibn Mujahid. He was the chief, reader in Baghdad, and people who opposed him, like Ibn Shanabud and Ibn Miqsam, they were tried, tortured, persecuted, according to sources, imprisoned. But we always look at how state enforced this kind of standardization. The Arabic script was not developed. It was derived from Nabataean, as Semitic philologists researched and determined. We didn't have vowels, we didn't have diacritics. Yes, there are certain ambiguous passages in the Quran that you do need vowels and diacritics, and this is why readers disagreed. The disagreement are on those, in these cases, where you don't know if you should use passive or active, you don't know who the subject is, you don't know how to conjugate, the verb, the prefix. And we even have manuscripts in Arabic, even 600-700 years after dots and diacritics were developed where you don't have diacritics. So diacritics and vowels are not the main reason. They are one of the reasons. They are one of the reasons. There are very, very obvious cases where, because you don't have diacritics and vowels, there were variant readings. It's very obvious. It has nothing to do with dialects, has nothing to do with plurality. It has nothing to do with different modes. It has to do with the script, right? And also Muslim scholars are divided. So, a group would say that Al-Hajjaj did introduce reformation of the script, and other scholars say no, he didn't, right? And I do believe, I'm inclined to say that actually he did include, certain, reformation in the text. Okay, so usually, of course, we have contradictory accounts in Islamic tradition. Everything, there isn't a single thing that we don't have contradictory traditions about. The point is, even if it wasn't Al-Hajjaj, let's say it wasn't him, this person specifically, we do know that there were certain reformations in the early manuscripts. So you have the language of pre-Islamic poetry and the language of the Quran. They are very similar, okay, in terms of syntax, vocabulary, etc. And even if someone like a Tabari, who's an exegete, he's always quoting grammarians. So grammarians are authority number one when it comes to variant readings. The Muslim scholars later on clashed with grammarians, because grammarians would be criticizing some variant readings. I would say, well, this reading is not grammatical. This reading is not good. And later, Muslim scholars who wanted to say, well, all the readings were correct. God doesn't speak bad Arabic. And this is why someone like a Tabari or Zamakhshari or even Ibn Atiyya, those exegetes, they were saying, well, wait a second, this reading is really not grammatical. This is bad Arabic. Arabs would never say something like that. And what happened is that Ad-Dani, he died mid-5th Hijri, mid-11th century. And he said, I'm going to limit myself, to 2 transmitters per reader, so that it would be easier for people to memorize these variants. And it became very successful. And it started to be taught at different schools. And what made it more popular is that 100 years after Dani, Ash-Shatibi came, and then he versified this manual into a poem. He versified it, and poetry is it's very important in the Arabic tradition. You memorize things through didactic poems. Well, we don't want people to think that the readings are the ahruf, because as I said multiple times, no one knows what the ahruf is. And if someone tells you that he or she knows what the ahruf is, well, no one knows. So we take the word of Muslim scholars who spent years and years and years trying to understand what the ahruf are, and no one knows. There are speculations, but at the end of the day, they're only speculations.
Is there a consensus on the number of readings today?
You have 3 groups. You have one group that will tell you 7. They have the other group that would tell you 10, and you have a smaller group that would tell you 14. So the system of the 14, has been around for the past 200, 300 years. People were, trying to add 4 readings. So that's why going back to early sources and reading, these documents, it gives us, a good map of what people thought at different periods of time, and not to apply, certain notions that people believe in now, but they were not existent, centuries before.